Hello, my name is Therese Pierce-Launala, and I'm the head of electoral processes here at International IDEA. And in this short video today, we'll be exploring why trust matters and the particular dynamics of electoral trust, but also some strategies for electoral trust building. And these strategies are important as part of institutional resilience in election management bodies. And I should say that we will shorten the word electoral management bodies to EMBs. So, for example, that's election commissions or election tribunals, but basically it means those who organize elections. So when you hear EMBs, that's what we mean. But first, let's think about trust. Now, trust matters for many reasons. But one of the reasons trust matters is it's just easier to get stuff done when there is trust. Imagine, for example, that a vendor can trust that he or she will get paid. That makes getting products much easier, for example. So it smooths transactions, and some call it a social lubricant. It makes compliance easier and cooperation easier, and so it just makes society flow better. And this trust is particularly important for public institutions. It's what makes societies work well. So imagine the COVID vaccinations, for example. So people trusting that the vaccines were safe makes it easier to vaccinate a population. Or in aged care, if you trust that an institution will take care of your elderly parents, it just makes that transaction or putting them putting your beloved relatives in that space, it just makes it much easier. And paying taxes is another example. If you trust that your money will be spent well and is not taken arbitrarily, it makes compliance with paying taxes much easier. So it is well known that high-functioning societies have higher levels of trust. For election management bodies, trust is particularly important. And this is because the key deliverable for an election authority, for an election management body, or EMB, is an accepted result. So not just that the result of the elections should be correct and accurate and represent the views of the people, but that result is accepted as such, because that in turn allows for a peaceful and stable transition of power. And this makes trust of particular importance in the electoral space. Unfortunately, the dynamics of electoral trust are such that it is actually particularly difficult to do trust building in the election space. And let me explain why. It's basically two things happening at the same time. On the one hand, we have the sheer logistics of the election exercise. So imagine it's one day across a whole country. And these countries can be vast with very difficult geographical challenges. Imagine Canada or Indonesia or Australia with remote rural communities, far-flung islands. And the logistics are such that the elections have to be delivered in the same way in the capital city and in these remote areas on the same day. Not only on the same day, but by temporary workers. That is, people who have not had the chance to practice what they're doing. So you're working against a very strict election calendar with hundreds of thousands of people who haven't had the chance to test what they're doing, and you're delivering materials to very remote places and bringing back very sensitive results. Remember that these results have to be secret, the vote has to be secret, and yet transparent in the sense that you know that only the people who were on the voters' register were able to vote. So this is a very complex operation with very little opportunity to practice. And this means that the chance of something going wrong do exist. This has always been the case for organizing elections, that it's a big logistical exercise. But more recently, a few things have happened to complicate this even further. One is the rise of special voting arrangements. This means the possibility to vote also in a different way. We see the advance of early voting or of postal voting and some experimentation with internet voting. And this adds an additional layer of complexity. And in particular, I want to mention out-of-country voting. So this really expands the area in which you have to get voting packages out and get them back safely and without any fraud. So imagine that logistical exercise and that you can't make any mistakes on the one hand. On the other hand, this other part of the trust puzzle, is the political pressures are enormous. It is in someone's interest that the elections go in a certain way. And it may even be in someone's interest that the narrative about elections or about that the results weren't correct becomes prominent. So you're dealing on the one hand with the risk of mistakes, and on the other hand with an incredible vigilance on the electoral process. Those who feel that they might be at risk of losing the elections will be watching everything with some nervousness and trepidation. And this means that any mistakes can be amplified, for example, in social media. And this amplification, the fact that mistakes happen and then the amplification of those mistakes is something that undermines trust. And trust is exactly what we said that election authorities need to make sure that the results are accepted. So these special circumstances of the importance of trust and the difficulties of trust mean that for institutional resilience building, this ability to understand how trust building works becomes particularly important. There are things that we know about trust building which could be worth taking into consideration when building your institutional resilience or your ability to build trust. And what we know about trust is that it is multi-leveled. That means that trust is being built on many layers at the same time. It's being built at the interpersonal level. So if we imagine in an election, for example, trust is being built in the polling station, in the actual experience between the temporary polling station officer and the voter. So that's one level at which trust is being built. But it's also being built at many, many other levels, including the most senior levels between the heads of the political parties and the senior election authorities, between government agencies and election authorities. And it is happening at all these levels, sub-regional level as well. And so trust building needs to take into consideration everything from the interpersonal to the interinstitutional. Another thing that we know about trust is that it is dynamic. This means that it changes. It changes depending on the context. So for example, when there is a crisis situation, when things are very fraught or tense, trust building becomes much harder. And it changes depending on the who is in the interplay. For example, who is the trustee and who is the trustor, who is being trusted and who is asking for trust to be built. And this changes and is fluid over time. The important thing to remember about the fluidity of trust, it means that you can't pin down a trust building strategy. You have to have an arsenal that you can pick from. And the third point I want to make about trust, besides its being multi-leveled and it being dynamic and fluid, is that it's multidimensional. So you can't just pick one, you have to pick from a range. And now I want to point out what that range of trust building strategies might look like. The first one, and it's one that is maybe a little bit overlooked, but trust is not just about delivering something, but it's about meeting the needs and expectations of the person who is trusting. And what complicates this is that those needs and expectations may be unarticulated. You may expect something of someone, and they don't actually know that it's expected. Let me give the example. It's your anniversary, and you haven't told your spouse that you want flowers, but you're expecting it, and you become disappointed when those flowers didn't appear. And this kind of expectations that they may not be known, they may not be written down, and they may not even, when it comes to institutions, be part of your mandate. So people can put expectations on institutions that are not in the institution's mandate. And that mismatch between expectations and what an institute can reasonably deliver is where mistrust or distrust can occur. For election management bodies, an outsized expectations are placed on them. They are expected to deliver something which is very difficult to deliver, as I've explained regarding the enormousness of the task. But the expectations of it being a fair process is one that of course, they feel heavily. But there are some things that are not in their mandate. For example, it could be media coverage, that you might feel that the media coverage is unfair towards small parties, but it may not be in the mandate of an election management body. So to build trust in the sense of meeting expectations and needs is really about taking time to understand what those needs may be and really prioritizing stakeholder engagement and listening. So it's more about perhaps managing expectations than it is about meeting expectations, because meeting expectations may be impossible. A second one that is very important is predictability and order. Predictability is extremely important for trust. There is nothing more untrustworthy than a chaotic situation or erratic behavior. You will trust someone if you know that they will always be there for you. This is an interpersonal trust. And the same goes for organizations or institutions. You trust a hospital to be open, you trust a library to have books in it. So predictability and reliability are very, very correlated with trust. For elections, this is an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, there is a predictability about elections. They tend to come every 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on the cycle. And voting often looks reasonably the same. This is an important point to remember because people are, in general, a bit nervous about change. And so this is something to keep in mind, that when something is changed about the voting process, this needs to be managed very, very carefully so that people don't get something unexpected. An unexpected new routine at a polling station, for example, is not something that necessarily builds trust. And so when reform is introduced, it's really important to bring stakeholders along with you about why this reform is needed and how it's going to play out. One more thing I want to say about predictability is that while on the one hand elections are predictable because they come every couple of years, on the other they are profoundly unpredictable. The context can be very chaotic as political tensions mount before an election, and of course the results are completely unpredictable. So this understanding that predictability is something to attend to in stakeholder relations is one that is good to take forward in how we build trust with our stakeholders. A third one that really fits into this logistics story that I explained earlier about the difficulty of delivery is that delivery and trust are very, very closely related. If you bring your excellent shoes that you bought in Milan, for example, on your special trip to Milan, and you bring them to a shoemaker's, it really matters to you that those shoes are well taken care of and repaired in the way that you thought. That builds trust with that shoemaker's shop, for example. So delivery and competence are very correlated with trust. Because organizing elections or rolling out elections is so complex, this really speaks to the importance of the planning processes in elections. and that planning really begins 3 or 4 years in advance, and that procurement is not done in the last minute, for example. So excellence in operations is a prerequisite for electoral trust. A fourth aspect or dimension that is very correlated with trust is this idea of cooperation and compliance. This one's a little bit complex to explain, but if we imagine a recursive relationship between trust and compliance or trust and cooperation, imagine, for example, that with institutions, compliance is easier. Take the paying taxes, for example. It is easier to get willing compliance to tax paying if the authority who is taking in the taxes is a trusted authority. But also, cooperation and compliance builds trust. And this is something we have certainly seen in the election world. The reality of elections now is that we are working in environments with threats of cybersecurity or threats of extreme weather that may occur during election time. Storms, earthquakes, forest fires, these are a reality for most countries right now, that the possibility exists, perhaps, of flood. Security threats are also a reality for many election EMBs at the moment. And this means the importance of interagency cooperation, that is, working with other agencies. In the pandemic, we noted that those who navigated organizing elections well were those who were able to cooperate excellently with legislators, because legislation needed to be changed quickly to expand voting arrangements, for example. But also now with security agencies and with civil contingency agencies, for example, in the case of extreme weather events. So building cooperative relationships is now key, and those trust-building relationships that allow you to be able to navigate crisis, they have to be built quite early. And this speaks to the importance of multi-stakeholder fora, of interagency cooperation mechanisms, liaison officers, for example, so that you understand each other before you enter into a situation where you have to work very closely together. And the next one I want to speak about is fairness. Fairness is extremely correlated with institutional trust. And if we imagine, for example, the court system, so I can exemplify this, it has been shown, and this is called procedural justice, that people will accept an outcome in the courts if they believe that the process that led to that outcome, even if it is negative for them, for example, a fine or jail time or a sanction, but they will accept that if they believe that the process was fair. This understanding is really important also for election authorities, because somebody will lose the election. In fact, most of those who are contesting the election will not win. And this ability to accept the results is contingent on accepting that all the processes were fair up to then. And this is summarized by a term that is extremely important for elections, which is this idea of a level playing field, so that all of the political contestants had the same ability to contest, that the processes were fair, and so that the outcome is one that should be accepted. Another one, they're all important, but these are all dimensions that are important to take into consideration. And this is about the ethical leadership, or what is sometimes called probity. And if you're going to accept that an electoral process is fair, this is easier if you understand the EMB to be of impeccable ethics and moral authority. Not only do they need to be guiding the electoral process with this impeccable integrity, so the processes have integrity and the people who are leading it have integrity, But they should also display this integrity in other ways. This means it's particularly important not to have scandals in other areas, for example, perhaps not having procurement scandals, even if they don't affect the outcome of the elections. But this can have a spillover effect. So any thought that you might not have impeccable ethical leadership can lead to mistrust that spills over even onto the electoral processes. So in terms of building trust, this speaks to the importance of very strong internal audit mechanisms, for example, the importance of emphasizing codes of conduct, perhaps professional development that emphasizes these ethical dimensions. It's important for recruitment, and it's important for your professional communication that it is values anchored. And now the final one is recognizing that trust is multi-leveled, that interpersonal is where really trust is built and lost. This speaks to the importance of the micro interactions and the importance of these being respectful also at the polling station level. And so to emphasize this dimension in training campaigns, that we treat our voters and our political candidates and our interlocutors, our vendors, and the other agencies that we work with, our legislators, with due respect in all that we do. So I hope I've made the point that recognizing that trust is dynamic, multidimensional, and multi-leveled, that all these strategies are part of an institutional resilience building. And I hope that you've seen also that I've emphasized professional development and this people-oriented, I mean, much of this is real people's skill sets, so really taking professional development very, very seriously will help in these trust-building endeavors. Thank you so much.